This is a question that we've probably spent the bulk of the last decade attending to. So Scott and James, they've already alluded to, you have this population of groups that are involved in criminal activity. And they've made this point about some of the similarities and the differences across these groups. And what this speaks to more broadly is developing this science of criminal groups. And when you do that, what it allows you to be able to do is to say, here's where you see the overlap and here's where you don't. Whether it's in their members and the characteristics of their members, and by the same token, the groups and the communities in which these groups form. So you could think about sort of there's a number of different ways that you could structure this, but one way to do this is sort of on this organizational continuum. Whereas, if you take these two, Weberian ideal types, on the one side, you have these really informal, diffuse groups. So you could think about this like taggers, some drug crews, party crews, things that they're more episodic groups. And then on the other hand, you have groups on the other end of the spectrum that tend to have stronger organizational structure, or at least believe to have it, and that they tend to be more hierarchically structured, they're goal-oriented, they have meetings and rules to observe and constitutions and so on. And so that's what you could think of as like the classic prison gang, or like the organized crime group, the mafia, and in some cases, outlaw motorcycle groups, and so on. And so you can make a lot of comparisons across these groups. And then you have this question as it relates to domestic or international extremism, political extremism, typically. And so, when Scott and I, about a decade ago, when we started surveying this literature, one of the things that we started noticing was, well, you're seeing with these extremist groups and these terrorist groups, whether they're cells or full-on organizations, is you tend to see some loose structure, but they have cohesion, they have an oppositionality, but a very targeted, group to which they're referencing. They engage in intimidation and violence, and it doesn't matter where it is on the political spectrum. This could be on the far right, like in the United States. We know that we have these neo-Nazi groups. You probably heard a lot about the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, groups that were involved in the insurrection at the US Capitol building back in January. But then you also have groups on the far left. This could be some of the networks nested with the Antifa movement. This could be the Earth Liberation Front. And it could also be, Islamist extremist groups. So to get back to, the focus of the question is just to say, there's a lot of speculation around the similarities between gangs and other types of groups. And this has to do with recruitment pools. In other words, who are they recruiting? Who are these extremist groups? What pool from which are they drawing? But it also has to do with conspiracies. So co-conspirators that are involved in domestic and international extremism. So there is the example, the Jose Padilla example, for example. He was a member of the Latin Disciples, a Puerto Rican street gang in Chicago, and he was believed to have plotted this attack against the United States with a dirty bomb. He had this long criminal record. He went to jail, he converted to Islam, traveled to Egypt, went to Pakistan in the late 1990s, and eventually he was arrested in Chicago. So that's an example of like a recruitment pool. Then you have the conspiracies. So the El Rucan street gang, they're originally called the Blackstone Rangers. This was a street gang that conspired with the government of Libya to bomb US government property, buildings, airplanes, vehicles. This is back in the 1980s. But they had their origins as a street gang. Their members were in their late 20s, their early 30s. And these two examples, the one of conspiracy, the one of recruitment, have been recycled over and over and over again as the quintessential examples of some of these linkages between street gangs and domestic extremist groups. So the more recent example, though, is with Mara Salvatrucha. And as anybody who pays attention to media will understand, in the United States, our former president made it, the MS-13, just an object of his focus. And the United States, they announced they would disrupt, dismantle, and destroy MS-13. And we saw through this cross-government collaboration an instance of the Department of Justice in the United States unveiling terrorism charges against 14 MS-13 gang members. And this is another example of this clear linkage. So Scott and I, back in 2014, I believe, we participated in the Radicalization Awareness Networks. It's one of these EU funding mechanisms. We participated in this meeting back at King's College over in London. And the focus is on extremism and how the internet is used to either elaborate or to facilitate extremism and so on. So we were staying at a hotel right outside the London Eye, that huge Ferris wheel in London. And the conference was over at King's College. It's about a 15-minute walk, and we would do that walk to and from every single day. And we were talking about, through this, inspired by some of the content of the meeting, about some of these similarities and the differences between gangs and extremist groups. And so we wrote up an article saying, look, we've got 100 years of research on street gangs. What areas can street gang research benefit the study of research on terrorism, extremism, and radicalization? So we ended up applying for some funding with our colleagues, Gary Lafree, who's at the University of Maryland. And what we sought to do was to do an actual comparative study. Most of these studies are all post hoc, right? Here's the data set on gangs and here's a data set on extremists. And then let's just figure it out. Let's see where we could see similarities and differences. Well, we went in there with the intention of actually explicitly studying it. So the group from Maryland had this data set called Profiles for Individual Radicalization in the United States, Pyrooz. And we took that data set and we said, look, let's see if there's any people through these life histories, if they have any involvement in gangs. And what we found in this large data set, it's got 13 or 1,500 cases in there, just about 6% had a history of involvement. So this idea that extremists are explicitly recruiting from pools of gangs doesn't have a lot of merit on its own right. And if you look at the population of gangs in the United States, you're talking about well over 1 million people. So you're talking about a very slim portion of gang members who go on to be domestic extremists. And so then what we did was do a comparison between Pyrooz database and a national database that we have on gang members in the United States, and just look at their demographics, their social, their economic, and so on. And we find that they're very different between one another. So we not only do we see that there's not explicit linkages, but we also see that they're very different in terms of culture, group dynamics, community, and so on. The people who go on to domestic extremism, they tend to be well off or better off than your marginalized gang member. They tend to be older, tend to have families, advanced educations in a way that you just don't see that with gang populations. So one of our main takeaways then is, at least when you're studying people who are involved in extremism and gangs, that this idea that it would be very difficult to take the policies and the practices that are applied to gangs, where we have decades of research, and then to see that they have applicability to domestic extremism. So what it means is ultimately the extremist cases, you need to probably have tailor-made strategies as opposed to those that were developed with the explicit focus on youth gangs. So that's my long answer to this, and I'm happy to elaborate more, but we do see that there are a lot of ways to be able to study these groups similarly, to be able to understand where they overlap and where they don't. And that would help advance theory, research, policy, and practice.